Good day to you all, and welcome to our very exciting procurement and supply chain webinar. Today, I'm Steve Morris from the Eventful Group. And a huge thanks to our great friends and hosts at Ivalua for bringing us the session today. And today's session explores the notion of zero trust. The risk of compromise from your supply chain partners is real. So a big thanks to Ivalua for bringing this to us. In a moment, I'll introduce our esteemed speakers. But first, just to give you a few matters of housekeeping, there are some polling questions, and it's your opportunity to answer and provide your input, which we would truly appreciate. Secondly, there's an area for you to send questions in, and today's very interactive. So we ask that as you listen to the presentation, as we go through it, you just keep those questions coming. We're going to get to them in a little while, so please make sure you fire questions away. We're very keen to hear your thoughts. And then finally, there's some resources that have been downloaded or uploaded into the system for you. There's a light blue down arrow key for you to click through and grab those resources. So please enjoy this session with us and Ivalua, and let me now introduce our speakers. First, I'll introduce Jarrod McAdoo, who's the Senior Manager Product Marketing at Ivalua out of the US. Jarrod brings over 20 years of procurement experience across multiple industries, including defense contracting, higher ed, retail, manufacturing, and engineering products. And during this time, Jarrod's held various roles in supply chain and procurement, and implemented shared service procurement models and source-to-pay systems, etc. He has an MBA from Duquesne University and a bachelor's degree from Carnegie Mellon. And then our first speaker, we're very privileged to have with us, Triplett, who's the Executive Director of Cybersecurity and Risk Management from Kearney, out of the US as well. Cliff's a senior executive leading cybersecurity and risk management engagements globally for Kearney. And he's currently advising the US Army on capability definition of zero trust, an assessment of their capabilities, and a strategy for moving forward. Cliff's also served as Presidential Executive Fellow for Cybersecurity in the Obama administration, where he was recruited to address the cybersecurity challenges existing across the executive branch of the US government. So some really lofty stuff, and we're very excited to host both Jarrod and Cliff. And with that, if I could remind you, send your questions, answer the polls. I'll hand straight over to you, Cliff. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve. Hey, a real pleasure to be here and to talk about this topic tonight. It's a really timely topic. I mean, we talked about setting this topic up weeks ago, but just last week, the President of the United States, as a result of a major breach and perhaps some other actions, but published a new executive order. And in that executive order, he told all agency heads in the US federal government to put together their zero trust strategy. And this, I think, really came to light and in the news, and the timing of the executive order was closely fit to a breach of a pipeline from the Colonial Pipeline here in the US, which cut off gasoline flow to the Northeast. But the big message here was this zero trust approach is really catching hold, and people were talking about it, but now in the United States, it got a big boost from President Biden. And so today we're going to talk about how that concept of zero trust might be applied to your supply chain and why you should think about doing that. But really, I think, let me just talk a moment about what zero trust is, and then we'll see where you guys all stand on that. So the definition that I like to use here is of zero trust is that no entity, communications link, or data should have persistent trust. You can't just check it once and think, okay, I'm good till the next day or time I log on, whatever. You have to continually assess where you are with that trust relationship. Are you talking to the individual you think you're talking to, and are they behaving as one would expect them to behave? All the permissions to view, edit, or any other interaction with the digital assets must be continuously verified at every practical step. Now that's it in a nutshell. And one of the big issues that the federal government had, and other organizations I've seen, is, hey, what is this zero trust stuff. I mean, it's kind of like, in my mind, the earlier days of cloud. Everybody was doing it, but what is it? But I think if you just took away this little definition, you're going to get at the root of it. Now, the first polling question I'd like to bring up as we start this is, what is a supply chain? Where does supply chain security risk stand in your organization? So if we could open up the poll, I'd like to do that now, please. We'll let it go for a few seconds, and then we'll talk about what I'm seeing here. Okay, what it's starting to look like is that it's an active initiative, but it hasn't quite made the management top 5. And that's really no surprise. I mean, I think that's where cloud started as well. It was being tossed around. People are thinking about it. My suspicion is with the current initiatives coming out of the United States, particularly President Biden, it's going to get more traction and will start to come up on the agenda. People asking more questions. But right now, it's not there. So let's just talk. What I'd like to talk about first is the risks. And if you're looking at your supply chain, these are just things that I hope you're already looking at. And if you're not, after this webinar, maybe you go back and ask your team, where are we in case these risks were to materialize? Have we thought about it? Have we prepared for it? And what have we done? So in the first one I have, on the list here is the order compromise. Most organizations have orders. Now, what if someone was manipulating those orders, corrupted them, lost your visibility to those orders, exfiltrated those orders and set them perhaps to include pricing to your competitors, or just post them on the web? And then there's always the chance that I've seen in many organizations, great concerns about fraud, false orders, false invoices, false payments, schedule manipulation, people potentially trying to maybe it's project sabotage, maybe it's insider threat. You have production and product impact. With today's level of automation, does not take much to compromise the quality of a product or even take down a production line. Simple manipulations of design files or automation controls, each of these could really cause harm. And then we have the shipping and delivery components, changes in destination, information. Think about any of these and their impact on your brand, your big those things are. They could even represent potentially safety risk or large financial embarrassments. But you also have non-cyber supply chain disruptions that are possible. And the nice thing about the zero trust approach, okay, it's great for cyber, but it also can be valuable in if you're prepared for cyber, you can also be better prepared for regular operational issues. And I think that's sometimes lost. That if you do a good job protecting the security, you can generally improve your operational resilience. So other events, let's think about what's in the news right now. India under major COVID disruptions, and how many organizations are to have some degree support out of India. Maybe it's your call center, maybe it's your remote support, your operations team for your computers. You have political issues, for example, embargoes and just supply shortages, whether that be for political reasons or raw materials. But in China right now, we're seeing a shortage of electronic chips in many products, and this is causing a disruption of the supply chain. And then, of course, there's always the natural disasters, whether that be weather, fire, or flood. So what can we do? And this is where the zero trust perspective can come into play. Are we sure, just from a simple cybersecurity standpoint, we're talking to the people, what are we doing from encryption, obfuscation, hiding indications of what we're doing, Are we monitoring our behaviors in terms of connections and the way our partners are reacting to signals we send them and such? But what I really want to focus on is two big principles, and that's diversity, okay? Because if you can't trust, and that's the old big idea, we don't trust that every partner we have is going to work perfectly, whether it's intent or not. But for example, on the supply chain diversity, we need to look at our suppliers and do a supplier risk classification. In zero trust, this is really core to it, and that is, as you look at the entities you're trying to protect, what is the risk is represented by each? And there's two sides to that. One, does it represent a risk, and what is the risk of it being compromised? And I'm talking more of that second. What's the risk it represents? And what you want to do is think about your suppliers in that same manner. Not all suppliers are created equal. Which of these suppliers are going to stop your production? So I would say if it's going to stop your production, and you could set your own threshold, let's say if that supplier was not servicing you for 4 hours and your plant shuts down, I would put them in critical. Maybe that time frame is as little as 15 minutes, but at some point identify what those critical suppliers are. But you also have important ones. An important one might say you can't build what you intended, but you can still build, or maybe you can build that at a lesser rate. If you start with the idea of understanding what it is we're going to protect, and this is where you want to put your tightest controls and your most significant investment in resources. If it's not going to impact production, or it's not going to impact safety or impact significant product quality, then don't focus on them. What I'll tell you happens here is if you focus on these guys, you're going to get what I refer to as the shadow effect. By focusing on some of the benefits that you're playing to protect those high valued assets are going to fall over and help you with the lesser. The next is supplier diversity. This is another major issue. If you do have a compromised supplier, well, let's assume you detect it. How do you continue working? Okay, if you have an alternative supplier, then you can keep going. The chance that both your suppliers are being compromised at the same time is less. And where do I need to do this? Focus on the critical important. You need to do it for everything, but if it's going to stop your business, think about supplier diversity. And then, do you have an alternative spares strategy? For example, if you don't have an alternative vendor, do you have a spare strategy? And a spare strategy may even include self-cannibalization. So depending on the type of industry, maybe you start thinking about, wow, I can't get the parts, so I'm going to start stealing parts for myself from this lesser important piece of business I have, so that I can continue those most critical aspects. But all this is about not trusting anything is going to be there tomorrow, that it's always persistently available and can be trusted. Now, the other one I want to go to is technology diversity. I'm assuming many of you are on this call, IT background or supported by IT. Some of the big compromises you have are attacks on particular vendors. It may be a attack on SolarWinds, it may be an attack on Microsoft, Oracle, you pick it. But if you're solely dependent on one technology, then you are highly successful, especially if you picked a popular one, which I suspect most of the people in the audience have picked some of the more popular vendors. For those most critical aspects of your business, you might want to think about a small investment in a diverse architecture, a diverse technology, so that you can sustain your business through that crisis. And again, this is back to that zero trust philosophy. You cannot continuously trust that trust that you bestowed upon a vendor is always going to be worthy. Now, as you go into your process implementations, okay, you have another potential issue. Are you in a federation or a single authoritative data set? So if you had to isolate, or you were isolated, would that shut down your business? Could you, on the other hand, operate in a more isolated mode and have a federated copy or some other means to continue operation? And then the last question is, can you even operate manually? Now, when I was at General Motors, for example, one of the things we did when we had to build cars, most of that was highly automated. But I had dumped all the build instructions to printers ahead of any kind of order. And what would happen is we went down and we had to keep building, we would just dump the build sheets right off the printer. It was a manual backup. And then we just could push the cars through the factory like the original days in Ford and continue to build cars. Would our rate go down? Yes. But did we stop production? No. What I would challenge each of you to do is think about, when you think about these, they talk about, let's do tabletop war exercise. Put yourself in the seat of the adversary, an insider type threat. You know your business better, hopefully, than the adversary, but not necessarily. What could you think of that you could do to yourself that would cause the greatest level of harm? Because that's the way you got to think. And have each a member of your team think like that. What would be the worst case scenario? If you prepare for the worst case scenario and have a response strategy, you'll survive when it happens, because it's gonna happen. Okay, that's again part of the zero trust philosophy, is that one of your suppliers is gonna be compromised, and that compromise may spread into your operation, and you need to be able to respond to it. Now, if you take a look at the solar winds and a couple years back, a Target breach in the U.S., both of those were perpetuated by a compromise of a supplier. Okay, when I worked in the federal government, I was asked to take a look at a breach of personnel background records. 21.5 million were compromised. How did the adversary get in? They got in through a supplier. And with the solar winds, most of the people were harmed because they had given superior trust to the solar winds company. Not that it's not a great company. Microsoft's great company. These are all great companies, but no company is perfect. And that's got to be your thought. It's not perfect. So what can I do to contain any compromise? What can I do to respond to it? And this is where concepts like supply chain diversity are really important. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about some of these mitigations that you guys can go through. The very first one is that identification of your critical assets. Now, I've worked with organizations and they've had hundreds, if not thousands, of critical assets when I talk to them. You need, for your organization, to get down to less than 25 classes of assets. So it could be my manufacturing plants, my power plants, my customer CRM, customer relationship management system, whatever it is. But get it down to about 25. And when you look at it, do it from the perspective of an overall risk approach. That the compromise of that asset will have this impact on my business. And where this then takes you to is the next question. What is your level of acceptable risk? So how much risk can you take? Can you afford to have one of your vendors compromised and turn them off? That would be an acceptable risk. If the answer is, I could do it for 4 hours, but I can't do it beyond 4 hours, okay, then which vendors fall in that category? Let's say those are your critical. Then do you have a strategy to mitigate that? How do you ensure, what are you doing to watch that that supply chain partner is not compromised? How do you continuously assess that relationship and their performance? There's also some excellent frameworks out there from a more traditional cybersecurity perspective. NIST cybersecurity framework, which has identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. One of the things we're seeing is in almost every organization I visit, almost all the energy is given to protect. And it's not a bad thing to do, but they overweight it. So if protect fails, then can you detect that the compromise has taken place? Can you respond and can you recover? what you see in many cases is the respond and recover is what's getting all the news. This is what's causing all the damage to the reputation of the organizations, and usually causing a lot of times a CISO to lose their particular position. Then a defense in depth model. All too often, too much energy is spent just on the perimeter. But today, with the new mobile devices, work from home and such, cloud, there's so many changes architecturally that the perimeter is soft. It's porous. You can't rely on it. So you have to look at a defense in-depth kind of approach, such as the endpoint, the perimeter, the platform, the application, and the data itself, and provide secure controls at every level, and being able to operate with each layer potentially being compromised. And you have to think about that. What if any one of those layers is compromised? Can I respond? Can I contain it? Can I recover from it? I would say for most organizations, you should probably start with the NIST capabilities: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Look at where you stand on the defense in depth, and then take another perspective from the zero trust lens. What I've seen is that those organizations who are very comfortable with themselves on the NIST and defense in depth, when they take that zero trust perspective, find new holes in their architecture. You need to take that same perspective with your supply chain relationship. If their systems are touching you or their processes are touching you, understand where and how they're touching and what's the risk they represent to your organization. Do you have metrics to manage these individuals and their performance? Can you determine what is good behavior and bad behavior? What's your monitoring technique? Are you proactive, or are you just waiting for something to break and then that's the signal because nobody showed up at your dock? And most importantly, do you have a response playbook? But ideally, the response playbook is when you see early warning signs, perhaps from your metrics. You're not waiting for the final event. And then the last big control here is restricted functionality. What we see often in almost every compromise is overprivileged accounts are compromised. And what they've done is they've said, look, I'll just give you an example. Finance. So you're a finance clerk, so you have access to our full financials. Well, why is that? Maybe they're just a payables clerk, so maybe it should be restricted to the payables function, or they're just a receivables. But why do they have more privileges into that? And then even those privileges, why are they 24/7, 365? Why aren't you time bounding them? What can you do to shrink your cyber risk volume? So these are things to think about, and those same things are true with your supply chain. How much access have you given them? What rights have you given them? Have you really tightened them down to the functions and perhaps machines or purpose for which that supply chain partner is part of your team? So what I'd like to do now is take our second poll, and that's really ask you guys, where is zero trust in your organization? Have you embraced it? And where are you on understanding these concepts? So can we begin our second poll? Okay, so again, I think what I'm hearing is that it's kind of our answer number C. We're hearing the term a lot, but what we're not seeing it fully embraced, with the exception of the infrastructure team. They seem to be the lead organization, so it's kind of a hybrid. Terms out there, everyone's starting to hear the buzz. It's kind of like cloud, which is what I thought. But what we're really seeing is the only place we've really figured out where to apply it is the infrastructure team. And my guess, COVID helped bring that to light with all the remote access. And so the energies around VPN and remote access. And what zero trust is often in that case is we're going to do multi-factor authentication and we're going to use VPN. There's far more to that, because if you look at that definition we have, that's not always a persistent situation, and it's not always continuously being verified with each transaction. So once you make that connection, typically in an organization, you could run around and do whatever you want in the organization. You don't necessarily have to, because the other big popular one was single sign-on, and that's kind of a culprit in the eyes of zero trust. So anyway, what I've done here is kind of covered some of the risks we see in the supply chain, some of the things that you might do to manage those risks. But the big thing I want to tell you and you to take away from this conversation is that you have to assume any component, any partner you have in the supply chain may be compromised. And can you detect it? And do you have a plan to respond? And so what I'd like to do now is turn over to my partner here, Jarrod, and let him continue. Jarrod.
Great. Cliff, thank you so very much for the discussion. And for those of you who think we're not going to get to pick Cliff's brain, I'm going to ask him some well-placed questions as we go through this. But I would like to encourage you now, if you're out there watching, if you have any questions during the process, feel free to enter them into the question mechanism. We'll be able to see those, and we can probably address it real time during our discussion. So, leading into this, I had an opportunity to discuss a number of different times with Cliff about how we were going to discuss items today. One thing we didn't discuss that he brought up was the target breach. And it almost caused me to get off this webinar, because when that happened, I was working in retail. I was in charge of a supplier management program, and I was putting in new procurement and supplier management software. And it was not good days at work. A couple of those times where I got some very seriously tough questions thrown my way, and I started to understand some of the concepts that Cliff was discussing there. So what I would like to do is I'm going to pivot a little bit from what Cliff mentioned and sort of give you perspective from where I'm at Ivalua. As a source-to-pay solution provider, I have the stated goal of enabling our customers to effectively digitize, execute, and manage all aspects of the source-to-pay process. Now, as I think about what we're hearing in Zero Trust, and as when we talk to experts like Cliff and what I hear is going on, I hear a number of items that are ringing true with our planning and execution for our roadmap, and how we as an industry and a solution provider are moving forward on this. And it is taking a concept that Cliff mentions and bringing it to life is a little bit of a dance. For an example, you might be having a different discussion with me where we might be talking about supplier management, where I would be telling you that the whole concept of the supplier-customer relationship has evolved from adversarial to collaborative, and they're our partners and we should work together. And then I would turn around and say, but don't trust them, zero trust. And it's not as different as it seems, and there's a dance you really need to walk through, like Cliff mentioned, in order to get these items. So when I think about the items Cliff had talked about: supplier classification, supplier diversity, risk levels, monitoring, mitigation. They're all really key aspects as a provider that we look to provide our customers. And as I would advise as a procurement professional over the years, that you should look for in your supplier risk and management functions on these items. So I made a couple notes as Cliff was talking through here, and there's a couple things that I just want to highlight and sort of bring to life, on these, and maybe I'll get a chance to ask Cliff to chime in on a couple things as well. So as he was going through, the first thing I really noted is we're operating on the basis of the ever lengthening supply chain. We even talked about it. Cliff even talked about it. We have a very long supply chain now. It's global. Even with COVID, it's not going to go away. Even with the incentives to reshore, it'll still be a very long supply chain. But one of those key resilience items is also to have a backup, which also makes your supply chain bigger for these items. So you really need to think about, when you're approaching a zero trust in being able to manage these is you come up with a concept, but you also need to look at the strategy and the tools for implementing it, because a very large supply base can make the management of it impractical if you don't use the appropriate tools and you don't use the appropriate guidance that Cliff mentioned. Being able to segment your suppliers so you can manage them, have the right tools in order to, launch, whether it's a survey campaign, if you need to follow up because you're continually verifying items, or whether you're launching mitigation plans, you have to be able to do those. And Cliff, I don't know, through maybe some of your experience, that you've maybe seen where people design really nice programs, but where it really falls down is it might be really dense, but maybe they didn't have the structure in place to actually implement it to get what they needed out of it.
Yeah, Jarrod, on that point, that's one organization. What I see is really two things often are some of the culprits. One, they bought a sales campaign and said, this is really good technology, I'm going to buy it. But they got the money for the licenses or the technology, but not necessarily fully appreciating the cost to deploy and maintain. And so they didn't always have the budget. The second part is they don't always have the appropriate skills. Okay, they count on a supplier just taking care of them. But the supplier needs to understand your operation. You have to, I think you made a good point, you have to partner with your supplier, okay? And collectively together, figure out what it is we're trying to protect, as I mentioned earlier, and put together a more holistic approach to the security on how to configure it. So what I've often seen is they buy it, a ton of shelfware, or they deploy it, and they deploy it in somewhat of a silo and without full respect of understanding exactly how the technology works and how best to configure it. And those two things then basically hamper the overall security program of that organization, because when they go back for more money, they didn't get the success from the first investment. So it's a caution when you buy technology. Don't forget the implementation and operation expenses, and don't forget to spend a little money on the expertise or training your people on how to employ that technology effectively.
That's a great point. The next point I wanted to touch on, which, Cliff, you sort of brought home a couple things that I learned throughout my career. When I first got out of school and I started in procurement, I was working for the Naval Nuclear Program. And before there was zero trust, what I was hearing about that, we were hearing a lot of, it was always trust but verify. And then I transitioned over to the commercial nuclear world, where we had a concept of human performance, in that you walk in every day understanding there's humans involved, so somebody's going to make a mistake. And what really hit home with some points that you hit, Cliff, is the fact that people put a lot of overemphasis on the protection. Where in some of my spots in my career I've been able to see is, yeah, you have the defense in depth, but you always got to assume that it's going to get penetrated. Then what do you do? And that's something that, working with our R&D team and working with our solution, I know we've really got through with the concept of, with zero trust, we're looking at the idea that we're always going to continuously be under assault. We're always going to be under threat, and we need to have the wherewithal, the solutions to be able to do that continuous monitoring, but also be able to take the necessary actions. So one thing, that when I hear everything that you're saying too is, hey, assume there's going to be a day, whether it's a big compromise or whether it's a little compromise that you really need to put out, to be able to, number one, identify that, looking at the continuous information, but also have the tools available to be able to take the actions to do that. So whether it be continuous risk feeds, where you're looking for items that, you're coming through. We talk about geographical risk, as we saw as COVID spread across the world. You're seeing outages, being able to see where it's spreading, what's going on now, being able to run campaigns and gather information on questionnaires, whether it's cybersecurity or other security in general, being able to run those campaigns, but also being able to document quickly and attach corrective actions, mitigation plans, or if you really just need to put somebody on hold too. So, when we have the opportunity as a solution to talk to talk to experts like Cliff and say, what does this mean and how do we bring this into play? Those are some of the items that we've really put forth in our solution to be able to look at. And it's one thing when I talk to my friends in procurement and we talk about how do you eat the elephant on this. When you have 15,000 suppliers, you need to come up with a risk program, and we chew the fat on it, is, what you need to consider and how we need to, consider these items, because some of the biggest failures that I've seen is from in my personal experience, is when the organization assumes that a defense in depth is foolproof. And then something happens on it. And then can you respond? Can you contextualize what's going on in your organization for that? Cliff, I don't know if you have any thoughts maybe around that one.
Yeah, Jarrod, what I really wanted to pick up was, as you began your last points there, what I was really thinking was it starts with sensing, okay? Sensing that, there may be risk, political unrest. There's an announcement from Microsoft of a potential compromise or flaw in their software, okay? Start to just see it potentially coming, okay? And think it's going to arrive. And start your response then. Start thinking and planning, how would you respond if this threat materialized? Don't wait for it to materialize before you respond, okay? So your overall organization needs to think about, there's something that just gut reaction, doesn't feel good. Hey, I've had lots of guys on my team, I told them, if you don't feel comfortable, start planning right now. Pull a cord, verify everything is right, okay? Don't wait for the event. If you just think it might break, start taking precautionary action. I'm telling you, I had a guy, there was a major attack. He felt uncomfortable. This guy was a director in one of our organizations, and we had all the guys. We had the CEO and the chief operating officer and the president and the executive vice president, senior vice president, he's a director. Okay, he decided to isolate an entire region on his own. He just said, I don't feel good. I think there's something bad happening. I'm cutting off the whole Middle East. Boom, locked them off. Now, most people would probably go into some kind of panic, pulling the trigger that low in the organization. But the organization gave him that authority, okay? I gave him that authority with the full support of everyone above. And he pulled that trigger and locked off. Now, do you think he got any hate mail? He got about 25 attaboys from everybody up the organization for taking the bold move to protect the company. And the fact his action did, I think, serve us well. But it was a bold action. So I think that's the second part. These risks can move at such fast speed. You have to have the empowered personnel to go take action, and sometimes even on a gut reaction. It may be, not the best call. He may make a mistake once in a while, he or she, but just even running the play is a real good thing for the organization. So I'm just saying there's two big points. Start your planning and response when you sense, even if it's just your gut. Go ahead and start planning the response. The second point is, Jarrod was talking about how many suppliers an organization has. Back to classify your suppliers. Focus
Absolutely.
on the ones that are the highest risk. Don't worry about the fact that you have 1,700. Worry about the top 10. Okay? Yep. Get the top 10 under control. They're probably the ones that are going to save you. The other, 1,690 may hurt, but they're probably not going to take your organization down.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think you dovetailed right into the last point I jotted down when you were talking is, that sixth sense, that seeing what's coming. I wrote down, context is important. As what you're feeling out there in context of your business, what business you have with a supplier, what trends you might be seeing. You can identify the hidden risks, if you're watching the trends and you get that feeling. So A couple things that, when I've had this discussion internally is the number of risks are so great if you have to manage it from a portfolio for a supplier. We talk about, you have financial risk, you have cyber risk, and that can have sub-criteria, galore on this. You have geopolitical risk, you have, a number of other risks. You can have environmental risk, social risk. There's a number of different items you really need to look at, and being able to access that data, and use your intuition, use your experience along with that data, and be able to trend it is extremely important. To give access to it. Once upon a time, it used to be if a risk came through and you found out about it, then you had to run around with disconnected systems and see what it was in context of this. So, really being able to bring that data in to respond, because that's what the landscape now requires us to respond to. On these ones. So, it's again, listening to Cliff go through, and as I run through what we try to do as a solution provider, I'm hearing a lot of good things. We'll take a lot of things back from these type of discussions. But, I'm hearing a lot of good things from these ones as well. So at this point, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to make one mention what you said, and I had called it out briefly as metrics. So, those could be early sensing things. If all of a sudden your supplier is extending its lead time, it's not delivering at the level of accuracy it used to deliver. The order completeness isn't as well as it was. You start to see a quality defect rate increase. These metrics all are early warning signs that you need to, in my mind, start your response plan. And so data is very key, and don't wait for the disruption. Look for those early warning signs that data can provide you if you have the right instrumentation. Back to you, Jarrod. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. And we had a question come through that it's a great question. And we got the question, trust takes years to build and seemingly hours to lose. And hours might even be a stretch there. You can lose it in minutes. The biggest lesson learned we've had in how to regain trust that has been lost. I'll give my quick perspective, and then Cliff is, I think it's a great question. So I've been through a number of different scenarios where we've had, compromises, performance issues, security risks from suppliers over the years. The biggest thing where we've been successful in mitigating and saving that relationship is when we're able to identify the issue. It really comes in the attitude of the supplier. It's not adversarial. It's with the understanding that we all go into that, there's always a time for the blame game, but right now it's about diagnosing the problem and solving the issue and rallying everyone around to make sure that we, number one, solve the issue and then do the proper investigation and corrective actions. Where we've had a supplier who hasn't been as willing to open up, that leads to other areas that they're not the partner for us. But when we follow some of the human performance issues that I mentioned, that mistakes are going to happen, we have to be prepared to deal with it, and we can collectively open up and get the information and work together on the mitigation. That's how you really start down the road of rebuilding trust. If a supplier didn't support us when I was running the organizations, they weren't a supplier anymore. If I couldn't immediately help diagnose the issue, and we couldn't work at it together, and again, there's some limitations. If there's any lawyers out there listening, I'm sure they would be advising their clients on some areas, but it really is about being able to have that zero trust, but that doesn't mean we're not partners and we don't collaborate. And Cliff, I don't know if you have anything to chime in there as well.
Yeah, I think the very first thing, and I think, Jarrod, just echoing yours, is when a supplier needs to own it, okay? Not try to hide it. It's like, look, we did not have this control, or we had a human error, or we had a training error, whatever it is. Let's find the root cause. And then I did a lot of manufacturing in my career. So one of the things we would do is, how do we error-proof or mistake-proof that? And then we partnered to mistake-proof it so that we collectively, both parties, work together, invest together to ensure that that particular event is less likely to happen, and ideally never will happen again. Opinion that we have mitigated that particular risk is how you get trust, because I really think it's how they behave after the event. Did they respond quickly? Did they put the right resources to it? Did they invest in fixing it? Or did they just do a server reboot? Okay.
Yep.
What was their response? They really go into problem management and try to mistake proof and prevent it from reoccurring. So owning it and working to ensure it doesn't happen again. I got to tell you, I've seen a lot of relationships improve after a failure because of the way we responded. Back to you, Jarrod.
Yeah, I think I'd wager you've seen a Kaizen or two in your day as well, coming from manufacturing and dealing with those things. At this point, I have a couple more points that, I want to address, and then we're going to have the opportunity to answer some questions. But, I have another poll question that I would like to, throw out. So would you mind, please, Jarrod, launching the third poll question? So in this poll question, how do you optimize your security investments to maximize tool effectiveness? So if you would, please take a few seconds to answer here. Okay, a couple more seconds, and then we can go ahead and take a look at results. Sorry, I'm letting down. Do I have to hit show results? Oh, there we go. So we have, sort of three top answers here, with the strong internal team, an integrator, and individual security tool vendors, a sort of split across. Is any of that? Oh, here we go. Take that back. We just saw the strong internal cybersecurity team. Cliff, does this sort of ring true for what you're seeing as well?
It's true for the larger organizations and much less true for the small. The large organizations, they've, as a result of, board liabilities now that they have, there's been a good, strong investment in internal security teams. But in the small businesses, they sometimes just can't afford it. And so they become much more heavily reliant on a system integrator or a particular tool vendor. So my guess is, looking at the poll results, that those with a strong internal organizations come from larger organizations, and those rely on the vendors or the integrators are from smaller. I mean, it's not a universal rule, but it's something I come across quite frequently.
So Cliff, we got a question in the chat that I want to see maybe if you wouldn't mind answering, because I'm curious as well. Is how important is embedding security SLAs in third-party contracts, and how can you ensure vendors are complying with security standards? I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think it's important, and it's going to be far more important in the future. I'm working with the government right now, and we're embedding more and more security requirements in everything, whether that's design specs for new applications to reinforce some of the zero trust principles in the design right from the beginning, to service contracts. I'm working with one service contract in the government, and we have, I don't know, probably 70 to 80 SLAs on zero trust in that contract alone, of how to assess and partner. But I want to say another good point you made, Jarrod, is these SLAs weren't meant to be clubs, okay? These were meant to create a common vision, and working with these vendors as partners as to, this is the roadmap we have to improve the security position. And if we're falling behind, let's make sure that we first had mutually agreed to it, and it's a shared responsibility to deliver. Because what I also see happen is, how do you expect a vendor to provide all security if it was never in the scope? they didn't know it was maybe their job, so to speak. So I think getting it in discussion right up front, what do we mutually expect of one another to improve security is important. SLAs are a way to measure, and you can have two-way SLAs. Also look out from the vendor, what would the vendor expect of you as the owner of the contract? And the second point is, how do I verify? Depending on what kind of vendor it is, there's independent verifications. But what I have done in some cases, when I was like at, say, General Motors, I would extend some of my security controls into their organization so I could get some sense of what's going on. But more often, I would just work with them to have their systems alert my systems so I can get view. And sometimes, if they really didn't have the teams, I would send some of my resources to that supplier to assist or to evaluate. We were going to do some major investments with a particular financial institution. Before we were going to ship our money there, we wanted to make sure the security was intact. So I and my team went down and did an audit, and we saw some weakness. We partnered, helped them improve their security posture, and went forward with the business. But sometimes you need to go down and visit, and sometimes you need to be able to make an investment in your supplier if they don't have the resources, and yet it's a supplier you wish to use.
Yeah, I would say I'll give you my perspective from my days of procurement. And once upon a time, back in the old days, I used to be a security auditor for our supplier management group. But the most frustrating but the most satisfying opportunity is to get into a heavy discussion, negotiation with a supplier about SLAs. You have an idea in your mind, the SLAs you want, especially when it comes around items like, security. You want to be able to see these items. And, in your mind, you just want the supplier to say, I agree. But Cliff brings up that good point. A supplier that is willing to have a hard discussion about every SLA and be willing to pare it back saying, I agree with your SLA, but in order to do it, you need to also commit to giving me X, Y, Z, really shows me that they're paying attention. And, it's frustrating as you're going through it, but at the end of the day, it's very satisfying to be able to say, I feel really good about where we stand with their posture and our posture on being able to meet these SLAs for that. So I have a couple more, points that, I sort of wanted to hit, going through all this. And, we have one more poll that I would like to turn to ask, and please, if any more questions to come through. So as I heard a lot come through from, Cliff today through some of the discussion, and again, I would encourage you guys from the standpoint, if you're interested in how a procure-to-pay solution would solve some of these problems, please check out some of the content that we noted to you to see how Ivalua does it. And you have my contact information, and I would love to talk to you about it in general, or if you have some specific questions, feel free to reach out to me. So a couple things that, I think are really important that I would sort of want to leave at the end of the day from a supplier management, taking a little higher up is, when you look at a supplier management solution, you really should look for a solution that is really going to give you a 360-degree view of your supplier. From what I heard Cliff today, he noted you need to be able to look at what your suppliers are, be able to classify those suppliers so you're managing them appropriately, and then also have an understanding of how you're engaging with that supplier, because that's going to determine effectively segmenting. What work am I doing with the supplier? What information am I going to provide that supplier in order to do that? So have that constant view, of this. And, a zero trust, always verify mentality. That's sort of noted here where, in the before time, it was trust but verify. Now it's zero trust, always verify. It means having on-demand access to all that information. And we should expect to be able to get that access to the supplier, being able to questionnaires, seeing the assessments, mitigation plans, looking at what transactions they have, what assets they're thinking of ours, the master data, and even reaching deeper into the supply chain on this as well. The next thing that, I would sort of recommend is making sure we have a comprehensive risk and performance management capability. We talked a lot about a number of different risks. Cliff hit on a whole litany of those. And there's a number of risks that you really need to manage, and they interplay. When you're talking about cyber, like geopolitical, you have other things going on. Able to, be able to manage all those items, track those items, look for those trends, identify that hidden data, be able to have some data quickly to back up that hunch. We've built our professional careers around learning our business and be able to take those hunches, like Cliff mentioned, on those. So, there are just a couple things to know to you. And, is there any final questions that we would like to throw out? Because I do have one final poll I would like to launch. So I'm going to ask if we could just launch that final poll, but if there are any additional questions, please throw a couple in before I turn it over to Steve. Jarrod, if you could launch the final poll, please. All right, we'll give a few more seconds here because I know I'm running up against time and I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. So this brings me hope. So right now we have a automated reporting from an integrated set of solutions is the top answer, which makes me happy. Supply chain management guy in me is happy. We probably didn't get everybody in there to react to it, but again, that's an encouraging sign for what we had. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you for some housekeeping. But if there are any other questions that you guys want to throw in, we might be able to answer a couple more.
Thanks, Jarrod. And a huge thanks to all of you for attending and spending this hour with us. What a fascinating topic, this notion of trust and your suppliers. After all, our supply chains aren't becoming less complex, and the responsibility you carry as procurement and supply chain professionals is huge. So to Jarrod, McAdoo, and our hosts, Ivalua, all spend, all suppliers, no compromises, a huge thanks for bringing this to us and hosting the quite brilliant Cliff Triplett from Kearney. A big, big thanks to you, Cliff, for making yourself available to come share your insights alongside Jarrod. I hope you've all downloaded the resources by pressing the light blue down arrow tab at the top right. And a recording of this session will be downloadable by Friday. That's within 24 hours. Through the same link, by tomorrow, in fact, by Thursday, through the same link. Please share it with your teams and your friends. You just go into the link that you entered through here, and when you click it, you can watch the recording and you can share it. And until we meet again, please take great care. Thanks so much again, Ivalua, Cliff, and to all of you. Thanks for coming.